Tene ta kasing ngumagan le ta tereng tanda kitang Saraha Doha jalbo Doha te la six jepa yichi yep nane ta tangbo nihza den pa re la tene ta lam ye lam re samjin nane ta lam chaja chimbo lam chaja chimbo ki bekap lam chaja chimbo te la yang pangja pangchul che ta nyamsul lensul number ni ye benane ta lam norwa tenzo pangu pe junsin number ye ye benane ta terenge kapsula dumba ndabo sisi je be on de ni ta demba ndabo ta tende chungwa la tene ta te yang chitang ta tanda yin dang Yeshe nibo te chenji rabo te tang tap tang hirap nin chenji te la ngaranso songho doje te pa tomo mayin pe chuke la wam shipa te te ta yin kiawa me pa chenji tabu te tang wam te tene ta tap hirap tang Yeshe chen number chenji te number ni ye na ne tene ta te la te ta bu ge ye tongba jewa me pa ta salwa hirap tang Yeshe che rang hin ni te yimba la ta te chitang ge te nesul go on se pa la teni tanda norwage ondo je na teni tap jitang ge zadang longdong tili ge nyamlin zamla rangi kowar shepa de la de ji jitang ge zadang longdong tili ge nyamlin la den ne tartu nelu ge dan shaja chenpo gamba la teni kalchewa yore te yina ya ti게 tene tapti 장발라 hinne tene ta ti게 tapti 장바 마도 nguni nelu getan shaja chembo mato na tene te parchi rabo jelandro cherna tene te la norning mare sone la parche pensare.
Continuing from before, there are within Saraha's Doha for the King 40 verses, and we've now reached verse 27. From within the presentations of the ground Mahamudra, path Mahamudra, and fruition Mahamudra, we are within the presentation of the path Mahamudra. That has two parts, showing what is to be abandoned, mistaken paths, and showing how to practice the authentic path. From among these two, we are still within the first, showing what is to be abandoned. Within that, there are 8 verses dealing with 8 possible mistaken paths, And we now come to the seventh of these. So the seventh part of showing how to abandon, or the necessity of abandoning mistaken paths, is verse 27. This is concerned with a linguistic term or symbol particular to the Vajrayana for the unity of the expanse and wisdom, or otherwise put, the unity of discernment and means. And this is the symbol or word evam. E represents the unborn expanse and also discernment. Vam represents wisdom and also means. So these represent the true nature, which is, on the one hand, emptiness, nothing whatsoever, and on the other hand, inherent or spontaneously present lucidity. Now, the mistake being pointed out in this verse is the mistake of seeing the experience of practicing the channels, winds, and drops in and of itself as the ultimate evam. The practices of the channels, winds, and drops are important and helpful for the ultimate realization of Mahamudra. But as was explained earlier in the text, these methods alone, if they are not combined with the realization of Mahamudra, and especially if one becomes attached to the experience of these methods or techniques, constitute an obstacle.
Tene ta te jisla shajaye korsong yorela. Tene shajaye teyon nekap ke shajaye mayimba. Ta tangbo tan tangbe ke shajaye ondse na. Ta chitan tumo mayimba Saraha ke shajachimbe ke ngur Doha korsong ke gomba la. Shajachimbe lam gombe kapsala namba ye yorela. Tani number yibo de kanderese na temba ta jai temi ta ni tene tanda jemi ta sum londe ta ye ga ta chite temba temi jemi londe number ye yo la tene te ya chaje chimbo gambe tuso tangbo de la temba Temba sedu ta chitange zo tene sem no inga ondo matongwa temba ta higingi songni jongwa tabje yimbe cherna ta zo sem hiwar nebe ke tab ndabo la tene sem hiwar nebe ke hinne jangba mayinba tene wo ne tembe ke jumata ke ngihi ta jeba tabje la temba sungi yore la dedang jaichi tene te jisla nipa te temi sungi yore la ta ti temba te nelu jong toni to top go ne ta ti tani tene toni ge sarchar da boda semji tenge sarchar da bo yapo je jilla jeva te ta rambu tangbo rang semje nelu te tangbo je ranging ki tomba imbala temba te ranging me par topa ta bje la tremi so je ta tremi te ne ja chewa la pel ne jewa me pa chutam chi jewa me par ranging to topa ta bala jemi hi sumba ta jemi te le gal ne ta chutam chi jewa me pa Zamaimba, Lolende pe yang tabala zipa de la londe de tati koram number yes on yore.
Ne tata shaloka de na samba ke chajeshi de marwa.
De mare. De chitang nelu saje ke.
Ola so. De tata shaloka
nel chaje ke hi yete la ye temba temi ti ye tinti chaje ke la jarsul
ola so
chaje ke la trutsul
ola so. Now also brought up in this verse is what are called the four seals or four mudras. And here, in order to understand what Saraha is going to say about the four seals, you need to understand a set of four terms which are not exactly the same as the four seals, but will be discussed in combination with them. And these four terms are unique to Saraha's presentation of Mahamudra in his three Dohas. And these constitute an explanation of four stages or aspects of the practice and realization of Mahamudra. They are recollection, absence of recollection, the unborn, and that beyond the intellect. The first is recollection, and that refers to the proper cultivation of the faculty of mindfulness or recollection and its attendant faculty of alertness in order to prevent distraction. In other words, this is practiced as a method for pacifying the mind, but in this case it does not just refer to tranquility alone, because it includes the certainty about the illusory nature of phenomena, as will be explained in detail later on in the text. Then, the second stage is called absence of recollection, or freedom from recalling. And this is where not only has the mind come to rest through the practice of mindfulness and alertness, but because of the heightening of the mind's innate cognitive lucidity, then that cognitive lucidity is able to recognize the emptiness of recollection, the emptiness of mindfulness. Then, through that, one achieves the third, which is the unborn, which is the recollection or the recognition that all dharmas are empty and therefore without true arising or unborn. And then, through that, one achieves the fourth, which is to directly experience the expanse of emptiness in a way that is free of any kind of intellectual contrivance or fabrication. It is therefore called beyond the intellect.
Tene ta te tabu ge tempa teme kimi londe namba yibo te la tene chitang ge gawa ye la ja ge la gawa ye na ne ta tangbo gawa sung ge gawa te khande na ta tangbo tene semte chitang ge ta tempa ta hi yin tum medemba tene noyin ta nyemon ba ta jepe ge kapsu tene lame menga la tene tempa ta hi yin tene tene semte hiwar ne pa ta tene te si chutam chi juma ta bu ge ni hi ta bu je wa te la di kap tana la kare yung ge wa se na sa la gawa je war njur wa yin pichar na tangpo gawa si tempa te gawa ta tene nipa te tanda nipa temirela ta te tabu ge tene tempa te yang ta tempa mepa che semji ne lu tombe namba tabu chu tam chi ge ne lu semji ne lu tabu zikpe ge kapsula ta temi sungi yorela temi che kapsu gawa te le chang che prato papa tene tanda choga hipa tabu ta tene tempa ta temi nika chutam chi jewa mepe ge ngonta tempa te chutam chi jewa mepe ngonta topa temi te chutam chi jewa mepe ngonta topa kapsula tene gadar chi gawa tabu gawa sumba tabu ta tene ta te je sola tempa temi jemi sumka lo lende pe ge tanto topa te la tenchi chi pe gawa ta gawa chepar tam papa gawa ye sungi yore la gawa yibo te na ne ta tangpo tempa gawe ge ranghin tang tempa ta tika sola kunzup jinwa na chopa te ya zigi yore la teacher na tini te la shaje ye na ne chu chi chaja se 다 동게 넘바 샤르기 와래 tene temi che kapsula tene kande zigi yoresena ta tanda gawa ye na ne nipa chogarela tene ta te semjin ne toni to zibata ba yimbichna ta te la jaye na ne yishi chi chaja tene ta te jesu la tene tanda tempa tan temi nika jemi jingondo topa te la tene gadraje gawa si ta te gawa tan gawa te la Khenchen me pa gadraje gawa si ta te lo lende pe ne lu jingondo tondo kapsula tene tanda gadraje gawa te ge ngowo te jaye na ni kandere se na tamsik chaja si tene ta te yendo tene tanda temba temi jemi somde londe jingondo topu kasula lenchi jibe gawarela lenchi jibe gawatela shaja chimpote ta tige tanda jaye da gawaye da ta te jarni temperse pa insare ta te tan tombe nelu ngoma go ontse pare
Ora. Now, these four stages can be correlated with the four joys and the four seals. Here, the four joys which are explained and the four seals are the authentic four joys and four seals. Di kapso te jajeshi te dendam ge wonde zena dang dene nosa ge wonde zena ni yorba. So the four seals are going to be explained in this verse in two ways. The first way is the way that they should be understood as a correct understanding of absolute truth. And then Saraha is going to return to them and criticize a misunderstanding or misuse of the four seals. So the correlation between recollection and so forth, these four, and the four joys and four seals is as follows. The first of the four joys is joy. And joy here refers to when, whereas previously you lacked mindfulness and alertness and were therefore greatly afflicted by the kleshas, through the instructions of the Guru, you become able to pacify the mind and also generate certainty as to the illusory nature of phenomena. The experience of that is here called joy, the first of the four joys. Subsequent to that, when you develop what is called freedom from recollection or absence of recollection, as was seen before, you recognize that both recollection and the nature of mind are empty. So therefore, the experience that is called freedom from or absence of recollection is a greater joy than just joy, so therefore it is called supreme joy. The third one is where you see that both recollection and absence of recollection, and indeed all dharmas, are unborn. And this produces a greater joy, which is called without joy. But without joy here means without a joy so great that there is no longer any attachment to it. And then finally, when you realize that recollection, absence of recollection, and the unborn are all beyond the intellect, that in their nature can only be cognized in a way beyond the intellect, then that is the experience of the fourth joy, which is called co-emergent or connate or innate joy. Now, to correlate these four joys with the four seals, and here again the four seals are used as according to Saraha in the correct way, because in the first one recollection, you see all relative truths or phenomena as they are. This is the Dharma Mudra, or the seal of dharmas, which here is understood as phenomena. Because in the second one, absence of recollection or freedom from recollection, which is at the same time supreme joy, you see the emptiness that is the mind's nature. This is the Jnana Mudra, or wisdom seal. Because in the third one, the unborn, you see that both recollection and absence or freedom from recollection are unborn, and therefore achieve that joy that is without attachment to joy. This is the Samaya Mudra, or commitment seal. And finally, when you realize that all of those three, recollection and the others, are in their nature beyond the intellect, and thereby achieve a co-emergent or connate joy, this is the Great Seal, or Mahamudra. Again, here the use of the terms of the four seals is in accordance with a correct realization of absolute truth.
다 대답은 다 사라하게 맹하게 때니 텐드 템바 테미 제미 론디 넘버 2보데 르구기 와라라 테니 다티 에옴지 탄다 테니 샤제기 탄다 가와기 탄요 대답지 레 라 다티 타르두고 온데 세바레 네갑가 온데 세나 다자 롱 틸레 감발라 테니 테니 루게 서로와 따보다 샘지 서로와 따블라야 되네 가와다 조가다 되네 가들다 레지지베 가와게 서로의 가와라고지 냠순용이어라 되네 대라 공도 템바타부게 자예 되네 추지 샤자다 이히지 샤자다 되네 당식 샤자다 되네 단다 샤제침부터 샤제게 마인드라고지 또니 다 대답이 냠뇽 서로와 답 뇽 가와 될라 힘이 다 렌지집에 이히 똑바리 세와 야 용기요래 소라라 드니 대 은이 렌지집에 이히디 냠스 용고 그래 마도 단다 가와예 루지 서로와라고 제다 드니 살롱게 맹어라고 될라 때니 다단다 타르투 글렌지집에 가와데 타르투 그 주인이 그 내루 또 저저침부터 또 톱나 야보래 마도 드니 타르투 그 저저침부 내루 마인발라 저저침부 내루 인발람 촐나 드니 주인이라고 제다 된 트로바티 주인 따버지 렐라 드니 될라 멜론 따와이 다 빼나 멜론 그난데 혀베 주인이나 따와다고 제레 티처나 다 단다 가신 휴바 인도를 겨도 자롱틸리 맹알라 때니 냠슬렘바 텐졸라 각바 난게 요아레베스나 타르투고 온드시나 각바 마레 디네가 디게 탑라 때니 타르투고 텐데 톱 탑레라 디니 네가 그 디니 초로와 때라 히니 타르투고 텐데 마도나 마도 파르 틴탄다 콘 인디 자요 체가 온드 템바 인도라 주기라 멜롱 그놈도 캬베 주니라 디니 의에 냠도 출나 벤토 쳔보 용기요 마레 디처나 은이게 녀한테 냠수 용고 그래서 오늘 템바레
So Saraha is saying here that what one needs to realize is these four things, four joys, and or four seals. That these are the true meaning of Evam, the true meaning of the four joys, and the true meaning of the four seals. However, we find that in the meantime, it is often the case that these terms, particularly the 4 joys and 4 seals, are applied to describe mere physical and mental sensations that arise through the practices of the channels, winds, and drops. So the physical and attendant cognitive sensations and experiences of working with the channels, winds, and drops are also sometimes called joy, supreme joy, without joy, and co-emergent joy. And sometimes the terminology of the 4 seals, the seal of phenomena, the wisdom seal, the Samaya seal, and the great seal are applied to these as well. The criticism that Saraha is making here is that because these terms are applied to the sensations of the practices of the channels, winds, and drops, if you thereby assume that by experiencing the 4th joy in that context, you have realized co-emergent wisdom, you are wrong. If you do succeed in realizing co-emergent wisdom through the practices of the channels, winds, and drops, then of course that's fine, and those practices have assumed their proper function. But the simple experience of the sensation of these practices alone does not constitute the realization of co-emergent wisdom, and therefore should not properly, he is saying, be called a co-emergent joy. He says that confusing the mere experience of the sensation of what is commonly called co-emergent joy for the true realization of co-emergent wisdom is like confusing a mere reflection in a mirror for the real thing. Again, as before, Saraha is not refuting or arguing with the validity of the channel, wind, and drop techniques as methods, but he is saying that if they are not used to bring realization of Mahamudra, then all that they lead to is something like a reflection in a mirror, something that it does not really perform any true function or have any true value.
Tene ta te tabu ta te tensin number jigan dainde zo kareten yore se na ta ngaranso lam main bala lam dun tulba tablam la tartuk lam dun tulba ta bu jeita tene kap la ngaranso ge tene ta tusam ge hirap ge ngihi ji bala lam yang ta bala tulni gombete nyamsam limba ta te tabu ge tulba tenzo tempare la tulba la tene lam yang ta bala hyuma ta ba tene te tabu kap la tusam ge nyamnyong ge hirap la tene hirap la heni lam yang ta bala hyuma ta ba kap la ne kap ga thamlam la heni lam yang ta bala hyuma ta ba tene hirap te yapore hirapte tusamke hirapte yapore tusamke hirapte nyamnyo jilla cheve ke torete yena yo tusamke hirap khona la hena teni dige neka tulgi yore la jeje degen tablam ge nyamnyo la ya nyamnyo de yapore dan tambe ge nyamdo cheve ke torete yena ya te khona la hemba de dan tambe nelu topu ge yang kapka la parchi na rogi yore la ta te tab lam manrowa main pala lam manrowa lam manrowa yimbar tulnyeng yo mare sonne tempare la ta te tanda jepate sachi jepate te pegone sachi jepata sexke pa ni saji pate pegone tempare la pe kandre resena tene ta tanda chome pe kapsula tene rochoge 미준 통그래 teni 미준 통두 때라 teni 코란 속에 산라 단등은이 게 초리 somne teni sta kom비게 다운 대 초리 som베게 산라 지베가슬라 teni 제 가완다 보지 제게래 당아랑 그 초tun지니 송 som바다 보지 초로와 제게래라 teni 로 kom비 동아 텐서 tena 주그래 때 옛나야 대초 랑 충분히 많이 봐. tene cho mahin pala chorun truba yin pichirna ta ngarange cho re samne juk de patela tene cho tungju nyepege ta ngone ge dewati yungi yo mare la cho mahin pala chorun trone juba yin pichirna tene kakom gre sem cho tunge sem ngambati yungi yo mare ti게 강갈이 용기 와래라 비테 yen도 단다 탑람라 타르투글람도 트바타 투성게 헤랍라 타르투글람도 헤니 네파티엘라 티닝 은이 그 그비게 단단라보티 냥스 냥투고요 마레라 티처나 단다 티게 단다 텐졸라 테니 테니 다 단담 네루 띵은이 티 솔고요 와래라 공기 단담 세르히 대와랭 다티 대와랭 따지보원도 보지시 디 단담 바 인섬나 팽기요 마레라 원나 가리고 그래서나 단담 네루 타르투바티 냠슬링고 그래.
That completes the first 7 of the 8 verses of our text, which are concerned with pointing out mistaken paths. Now, to summarize these 7, mainly they are criticizing 2 things. One is the mistaken perception of the path of method or means alone as sufficient for bringing realization of the ultimate. And the other is becoming attached to the discernments of hearing and reflection. The problem with these 2 mistakes is that they're incorrect, they're bewildered, and they therefore prevent you from entering the authentic path. So either attachment to the discernment of hearing and reflection or to the experience of the techniques of the path of means can be an obstacle. Now, this is not saying that the discernment of hearing and reflection itself or the experience of the path of means itself is an obstacle. The discernments of hearing and reflection can be very helpful, but if you become attached to them alone, they become an impediment. The experience of the path of means can be very useful, but if you become attached to it alone as an end in itself, it becomes an impediment. And in either case, you are prevented from realizing absolute truth. Now, the 8th and final verse of this section, verse 28 in our text, summarizes the idea of what's wrong with a mistaken path, using the analogy of a deer chasing a mirage under the impression that it is water. The deer is thirsty and is looking for water. It therefore, by misapprehending the mirage as water, seeks to relieve its thirst. But since the mirage is not water, it does not perform the function of water. The deer's thirst is not relieved, it remains dissatisfied and suffers additionally. In the same way, if we become attached to either the path of means or the discernments of hearing and reflection, then we do not achieve their purpose. Their purpose is to lead us toward the realization of absolute truth. But if we become attached to them as ends in themselves, then we prevent them from serving their true function. And like the deer that remains thirsty, we remain suffering without true realization. Therefore, it says in the 4th line of the verse, claiming it is ultimate, some take up bliss. Thinking that the experience of the bliss or pleasure of the path of method is ultimate, then they become attached to it.
Tene ta teacherna ta tanda karigogi waresena tene kerdo ngaranso ge chula jangba ge tusam ge jangba yung gogi warela tene chula tusam ge jangba gogi yore ti la tene rang la pengi yore chu ge nelu higi yore gom la pengi yore la tene te tu som ge jangba na kapsula tene je gombo bisong na ta ngaranso tene je gombo bi jinju tenju ge tu som gom som tumar sa usong ne tu patong samba se bi hortna la gomba te rogo yo re so re la tene tu som ge kapsula tu som jangba ma imba tene te chaje chimbu ge nyamlen ta dotni tanyam ga to jitop ge nyamlen to dotni tene tu som sia na tene ti tu som la tene gom la tene tu som la pemba ya po yung yo la tene ti chitang ge tu som te gakpa mare te na te la tene par du nyamlen nang ko yo re tene te gendo tablam je kap ndabo je yen nang aran so ge tene lam nang jur gom be kap yeram ji nyedup si be kap tene ta te gendo la tablam je zorem gom be kap tene nyamlen ten so pe kal chempo re la kal chempo yimba yendo la kare gu gi yo re se na je chaja chempo ge nyamlen tong ma dal wa je te chi sem ji ne lu to pe ge nyamnyong tong ma dal wa je ge ngone ne nyamlen se chi chom na pe kal ba sang pa do ro gi yo re la te yendo tan dang un ne ge nyamlen se pe kap ma yin na yo ta je tang ge je thop je kap da bo la tene ta je lu gwani chakor la sopa chadon kora la sopa ta sepan tabuji yinaya rong tene ngaga gwani khanden deje la sopa sepe kab yinayo rong te yendo tanda semje gwani yinla chambaton hije la sopa gombe kab yinayo rong te tabu kab salaya chitang chaja chimbu nyamne maji pandabu ta te tendo yermi to chidr to thoge yonayan da menayan rong te sati ngi tong matal waji kalche wa yin bicherna tene tanda kamdana la Saraha ge sona ji te pangu ge yore lam norwa ji te pangu ge yore sone ta ti ji te kandre sena tartu ge nelu top ngi te pe kalche wa re te da matal wa yin ji mi ji gu ge re so
We need to cultivate the aspect of our training that is the discernment of hearing and reflection. Because this helps practice, it enables us to understand Dharma, and it therefore helps the practice of meditation. But even when we cultivate hearing and reflection, we should not do so in isolation from the practice of meditation. It was said by Lord Gampopa, whose tradition we follow, combine hearing, reflection, and meditation. That means that when we practice hearing and reflection, we also practice meditation. We combine our study with the practice of Mahamudra meditation, both in its meditation and post-meditation aspects. This helps us understand insightfully and properly, and our understanding, not being divorced from practical experience, helps that experience develop. So therefore, we are not in any way being taught by Saraha to avoid all hearing and reflection, but to make sure that it does not become an end in itself or divorced from practical experience. And in the same way, we do practices of the path of means, the generation stage practices of yidams, and the completion stage practices of the path of means as well. These are very important and useful, but they need to be practiced in a way that is not divorced from Mahamudra experience of the mind's nature. And even in post-meditation, whether we are engaging in physical acts of virtue, such as prostration and circumambulation, or verbal, such as liturgical practice and mantra repetition, or mental, such as the cultivation of love and compassion for others. All of these virtuous practices need to be combined with the practice of Mahamudra, which at best means combined into one, so that the two aspects can be cultivated simultaneously. But if not, at least practiced in a way that is not devoid of the recollection of Mahamudra experience. In that way, we avoid the 8 errors that Saraha has pointed out in these 8 verses and become able to pursue an authentic path.
Tene ta tige lam jenjin pangpe ke ta tsur de song ne ta de ji so la lam ngu shaja chimpu ke lam ngu de tempare la shaja chimpu ke lam ngu de ta tanda kondu hu ba yendo la lam khande ji ten yo re se na temba teme jeme londe namba ye go ne ten na yo re la tene ta teyang tanda lam tempe kapsala ta tangpo ndor tempa tabuji ta tela choje chimbu tanda Doha korsum ka gomba tartu siya na mengo ka da yesung ki yorela mengo ka da ndabo tela namba yeten ki yorela mengo ka da yen ndor tempa chay tang tene te da yete rimba yendola nyamsul lensur jepar jepa te namba ta chitang sachi ye ndabo rem yendo ten yore la ta te ina ne tangpo ta da yete mengo ka da yete ndor tempa te la ta tangpo ta tsayu tsik kong te na kunzup song yore kunzup tempa song yore la te kandere se na kunzup tempa te ta tempa re kunzup tempa nonsul te juma tabu topu go ne tene ta tige semte maimpa tenhe dang tempa tingen sen dang tempa te la kunzup tempa sungte tempa tempa re ta te je so la nipa temi de la tempa me pa la tene tempa me pe ka so la tene sem dong sem ne me par churba wo sungte te la tene zawa sem ga number to pa tin so pa hiene tene tige semji rang semji nelu to pa la tene semji number to pa tin so hiene tene ta ranging ki ngo semji nelu tu pa tang tarwa te jetawa yendo topa yinpe china me parchirwa o ta te tabu ta te tempa tang temi ni ta te je so la jemi ke tan tempa re la jewa me pe tan te ten yundu te la te ni yon su churba si ta te sen je ne lu topa te ta chitang ke chizung yu do non zimbe sen ni ke nani tangbo sen je ne lu topa temi te nang sen je ne lu topa re la ta te ja cheru tang ne teni sem khona ma yinpa sem ji chapung hizi ki chu tam ji teni jewa me par topa te la teni yon su churban chok chok ta te le tempa le chong chok tu churba ta je la ko yo re la ta te jewa me pa te jewa me pe tan te yang ta rim yen de sar cha ta dem pe go ni lo len de pe tan to pa te la chok tamba ta te chok za yu che ko de sin chok tamba song yo re la chok tamba sin ki ti kare ten yo re se na lo len de pa te ten yo re la ta ti jun sin ti cher na ta mengo ga da ye de tempa temi jemi londe namba yiboti trota ki hibar chi he sonne ta ti chaja chimbu kitande gong ko yore.
So the first part of the presentation of the path in these 8 verses has been presentation of various types of mistaken path and the instruction to avoid these. Next, starting with verse 29, Saraha demonstrates or explains the actual or authentic path of Mahamudra. And as was mentioned earlier, he presents the authentic path using the unique terminology of his 3 dohas in terms of what are called the 4 symbols of instruction. Initially, these are briefly explained or summarized in verse 29, and then following that, they will be explained in detail individually in the succeeding verses. What is being said in verse 29 is that the 4 symbols are as follows. The first is recollection or recalling, and recollection is the recollection of the illusory nature of phenomena. It is therefore the recollection of relative truth. The second is the absence or freedom from recollection or recalling. And that arises when the mind and mental arisings, thoughts and so forth, have been pacified through the force of recollection, and one sees as it is the mind's nature, which is beyond elaboration. And that seeing the mind's nature beyond elaboration is referred to as freedom from recalling or absence of recollection. The third is the unborn. And in the verse itself, it says, when completely transformed, this is the top of the supreme. Now, this refers to the point where, whereas previously one had recognized the nature of mind as beyond elaboration, the top of the supreme refers to when that realization becomes all-pervasive. It becomes vaster in scope, so that one realizes directly that this is not just the nature of the mind, but the nature of all phenomena. In that way, one recognizes that all phenomena, all dharmas, are unborn. Now this in turn leads to the fourth, which is beyond the intellect. And this is referred to in the fourth line where it says, the result is the genuine supreme. The genuine supreme is the complete realization beyond the intellect of the nature of all things. So it is these four, Saraha says, we should know. When he says, friends, you should know this. We should know that the authentic path consists of recollection, freedom from recollection, the unborn, and beyond the intellect.
Tene ta te la yang rimba yinto la ta sanji je ka dan jaru kaps la sanji je ka ina ne tingen zen number yesam yore la tene tingen zen number yibote ta Saraha mengo ga dai yete jarne song yore la tingen zen number yete kandire se na juma ta bu tingen zen da jai singe je tingen zen da ni tene ta te yendo tanda power tingin zantong som dojeta bu tingin zanta ya som yorela teni ta te ta bu ge tingin zan ye ta ramba yindla jarne tangbo tremba te teni tanda jumata bu tingin zan teni trembe ka so kunzo no atam ji charge yorela kunzo no atam ji charna jumata bu zikba yin bicherna jumata bu tingin zan 다 재미 제 가서라 되니 kunzup 노아 텐조 제 제무 넘버라보제라 아 되니 제무 다버제 마도 텐도 지량 마도 빠다버제 임베처나 되니 다 데라 템베게 넘도다고 다 데야 주마 다 가리세 그룹 제무라보제라 지바 임베처나 되니 데라 싱게제 띵엔자이 되니 다 데제슬라 단다 되니 숨바티 게미테 다 추통지 제와메 바도나 강라요 냠가와메 바 파오동 다와인 비처나 파워른 루팅엔자이 되니 로렌데 베캅슬라 되니 제 힉미니바 템본다고 텔란도와인 비처나 되니 도지다 루팅엔자인데 되니 팅엔제 다디게 사라하이 맹어가 다이게데 지당게 산지지 까인노네 숨 팅엔제 넘바이게다 자르네소.
In his more detailed explanation of his four symbols, Saraha will combine them with the, or compare them to, or identify them with, maybe that's better, the four samadhis spoken of by the Buddha in his teachings. And the four samadhis are the illusion-like or illusory samadhi, the samadhi of lion's play, the heroic samadhi or the samadhi of heroic going, and the vajra-like samadhi. The first of these, the illusory samadhi, refers to the first level, recollection. As we saw, recollection is the seeing of the illusory nature of relative truths. The second is the among the four symbols is freedom from or absence of recollection. And at that point, one further sees that relative truths have no true existence, are mere play or mere display. And in that way, one achieves the samadhi of lion's play. The third, the unborn, is the achievement of a state beyond fear, because one recognizes the unborn nature of all things. Therefore, it is the heroic samadhi. And the fourth, the realization of that which is beyond the intellect, being indestructible, is the Vajra-like samadhi.
Tene tate dor tempa tabuji. Tat chitang ka tempa temi jimi. Namba ye yo londi, namba ye yo re son re la. Tate je so la, sai su chepa sum chupa te. Ege on sai su chepa sum chupa ton soji pa ton soni sosam tate sai tenju ge je pra he pa re la. Tangpo te la je pra he pa tang dor tempa ni te se korem da bon ra yo. Korem dabon raga yo mare ta chitang on de sena tremba te tangbo temi te nipa tene jemi te sumba londe te yiwa ndabo ji rete ta saraha khongri gengur ge nando ya jepar sumbu kapsul la tangbo temi te ten tene te jesola tremba te ten te jesola tene jemi te ten ta te jesola londe te tempare la Tiki Junsin de country se na Tangpo ni tini jay tempa de hini tangpa tapo main par tini senji nelu topu go ni tangpo tini tati topa de junzi ji tini te tempa tang ji de jima tini te tempurzo ya de menga go on se patapo ji yimban ra la tini junsin ti cherna tangpo tempa de matin para temi de ten yo la tini ta te yi kapsula temi de single number 0 tingen zen ta ki pare single number 0 tingen zen ta ki pa yin be cherna ta ti sem te ya sem rang nelu tope tini nelu tope go ni ta chitang tenhi ki singi yo are sina tenhi ki singi yo are te tenhi te ya rangi madpa tang senji nelu ta tenhi ki nelu ngo tikpa ta tingen zan ma jorne ta te tabu ke temi ke tingen zan de ta gamba la tene gamba to topa la tene nye momba yons ta pa on te ni to nye momba ta ti ke tene sem te nye momba te pangja dodo ndabo che Tela jamsi ki nyembo dodo che ki jamgi warvisina mare nye mompati ranking madu pa yimbala nye mompati ranking madu pa yimbala yimbra hipi go ni jam pangi warala ti cherna ranking ki tolo ware tati pe ta ten ichi go ni ten warala tati tambo tenchi tati pe go ni ten undi tela tambo meto te ndamji na ni che gi ware te ti meto de ya che sa den damji go gi yo mare la tini junsin teacher na temi ken nyamdang demba te tini sipa konsong korwa le tini nipa le gyal ne tini nipi kenji mugu pa yin so
That's the brief explanation or outline of the coordination or identification of the four symbols with the four samadhis. After this, in verses 30, 31, 32, and 33, Saraha explains these individually or in detail. However, when he does so, he does not do so in the order that he has previously established. He has previously explained that the sequence of practice is recollection, absence of recollection, unborn, and beyond the intellect. However, when he explains them in detail, he starts with absence of recollection, then returns to recollection, then explains the unborn, and then beyond the intellect. The reason for this seems to be that his presentation of absence of recollection or freedom from recollection in the beginning is so that through the cultivation of recollection alone, we do not merely cultivate a state of tranquility, but that before beginning the proper practice of recollection, we are already to some extent familiar with the mind's nature through the presentation of absence of recollection. And that having gained some familiarity with this, we are able, through the subsequent practice of recollection, to stabilize this. In short, in verse 30, Saraha presents the practice of absence of recollection, which is identified with the lion's play samadhi. Now, when he says in the first line, the mind free of recalling engages in samadhi, by saying engages in samadhi, he is, by implication, affirming the presence of the faculty of recollection. But at the same time, you are free of recollection or recalling because you have recognized the nature of it and the nature of the mind. And this recognition of the nature brings freedom from the kleshas. Therefore, it is completely purified of the afflictions. Now, the afflictions are conquered by the absence of recollection, but not as though it is a solid thing overpowering or conquering or crushing another solid thing, but because the absence of recollection, that insight, is itself seeing the non-existence of the kleshas, and that insight into their non-existence is what conquers them. Now, in these first two lines, Saraha has presented his meaning, what he is trying to say. In the latter two lines, he presents an analogy to substantiate or illustrate that meaning. In the latter two lines, he says, as the utpala born from a swamp is not stained by it, so the mind itself is not affected by the faults arising from samsara nor the qualities found in the victorious one. The image here is the utpala, which in its purity, regardless of the nature of its environment, is like that freedom from or absence of recalling.
Tene ta te jesla sexjepa sunju soji patige ta tempa la. Tene tempa te tanda chitang koram tardu sena tempa ta temi ni de tangbo tempa ni pa temi imbala ta tanda kap ndar temi ji jes tempa tengu pi junsin te kandere sena tene ta te long ge nyamnyon da bo ta shaja chimbe nyamnyon te si ji ne nelu de to na yang tene tra sini yo ji ma imba tene tanda ngarang ge tujon de hege yo la tanda 타보다 희놈자가 맹어가 논들라 드네 텐히 템바다 상가르다 제바 텐히 상가르다 제바 그 인지 민지 데 갈쳔보 인성 요아라 준신 데타르도 깜더리야 드네 디게 다디 셈지 네루데 또나야 텐히 데 마지 바지 갈쳔와 임비처나 샤지쳔보 검베가서 템바다 희긴데 갈쳔와 임버템베체도라 템바디 테미데 nante tempati Yeshe tempa insarila ta te tabu juma tabu rungi perse te tempati chewe kapsala tempati nzambata chepa maimba juma tabu ngone tene ta te topa te la tene ta te topchi tene ta tempati tene gombar chepa te tempa ingado.
Next, verse 31 explains the practice of recollection. Now, as we saw in the brief presentation, we would expect recollection or recalling to come first, and freedom from recalling or recollection to come second. The reason, however, why the freedom from recollection was presented first, and now recollection itself second, is that even though one has gained some insight into the mind's nature, into Mahamudra, that experience cannot be just left alone or abandoned. One has to cultivate that. And as was said by Dakpo Tashi Namjo, the cultivation of that insight requires sharp and lucid mindfulness and alertness. In other words, after the initial achievement of the recognition of that nature which is without or beyond recollection, one still needs to apply the faculty of recollection in stabilization of it. So it seems that it is for that reason that Saraha here has initially presented freedom from recollection and subsequently, in verse 31, the practice of recollection. Nevertheless, he points out in the first line that the faculty of recollection here, because it succeeds the recognition of the absence of recollection, is one that is free of fixation, and therefore is recollection that sees the illusory nature of things. Therefore, it says, recalling also sees with certainty that all things are like an illusion.
Tene ta terintana yogi-la. Tene te six-jipanga ta terin hyubare-la. Tene terin te zomto yogi-la. Tene ta ngarange hyujije-la. Tanda kasin ngaranso sasha dukang sasha sena separe-la. Tene chenomba kanga pe. Tene kanga gawo nane. Be gawi jisi iranane pepala. Ngarang tambo tuji che. Garden che be hyogyen ngarang be sempa gabu jong tuji che hyogyen tene ta tela chitang ngarang so dambe chu ge tne ge on de se na tene tangbo ta be kongjing ge be la sanji ge tempa tarware lama ji sin cheparji mambo chembare la tene chembare tene tela sanji ge tempa ge on de se na tu som hid tu sam go on the sena yanda duba nyamling go on the sena yanda teni be nima hyawanda bo de chungare la nima hyawanda bo chungare de yin ya teni te tanda satra go on the sena teni himalaya roti rawanda bo ji sin korni teni ti na la be thar de par ma to ti chilo la hira thar ma ta panda bo marat ne marab la lo ju teni chungare la teni chitong gujang achung agulo ni ta phela ching ngamba nda bo tang bo ching ngamba nda bo sungwa de ti yina ya ti ching ngamba ti ge himalaya ge ro ti tor ni tini ta che speg sanji ge temba te che ti himalaya ru ge chiro tar ji ba kalva sambonda bo je chungwa re la tini lokha la tini himalaya ro ti torwa re ti yina ya ta tanda Gyamtso chimpo tenso, hide Gyamtso ta, Atlantic Gyamtso tenso, tormato pa. Yan te si jagar la, tene chonte pare la, tene ta ti kaps la, tene loma tepa tang tempa kaxie pe, lama chenle tang tempa kaxie pe, ne ta Gyamtso chimpo ki rawa tenso torne, tene tantan zombi len kasakala, tene sanji ki chenle rabo te pe, pial ne, tene ta kasakala sanji ke tempa la tar tene lama ji sin tamba mambo pe tende dinani zo tene jaung kama pa tene jaung kama pa ke tene jongkin la kalur mboche ta tene tumbar mboche namba ni zo se pa je ke tene pe ne tene sanji ke tempa tar ne be zombilen kasakala tar ne kalba zambunda bo chung
With the explanation of those 5 verses, I'm going to stop for this morning. But there is one thing that I would like to say, and I would like to begin it by thanking all of you for taking part in the consecration of our retreat land yesterday with so much enthusiasm and joy. About the spreading of the Buddha's teachings, at this point, many great teachers have come here to this country, and therefore the teachings have spread very much in the manner of the sun rising. For many generations, the teachings of our tradition never went beyond the enclosure of the Himalayas. So for a long time, we could say that the Himalayas were like a fence or a wall that contained our tradition and kept it from spreading outward. The great adversity which afflicted the people of Tibet in 1959, from the point of view, looking at it from the outside, also had the effect of breaking down the wall of the Himalayas. But the dissemination of the teachings was still somewhat held back by a second wall, which is the oceans, which cover much of the surface of this planet, the Pacific, the Atlantic, and so on. Eventually, however, the wall of the oceans was broken down by great teachers as well. And so at this point, the Buddha's teachings are all over the place. Especially, this came about through the activity of His Holiness the Jawan Karmapa and his representatives, Kalu Rinpoche and Thrangu Rinpoche. Through the activity of these individuals and those who followed them, this land has become very fortunate in possessing the Buddha's teachings.
Tene ta konambe ke tene la tene ta tanda jitang me kanga chula me mangbo chula depa yeba chula depa yeba teya tene drase mondi maimba tene ta sosuge nyonyon la tene namba sanji be chunde ta ngaranso jitang jishap ko onde sena zombie le na pen tonking ki chuyimba 다 세라고 온데서는 랑랑수수 게게 메셀 펜통킹이 취임바 시니 드니 메강가 다제 카검니 추구니 배 취라 뭐바침부 여네 다지 취지 간이 더 취야보지 간이 더 그래 취야보지 간리지 냠슬랭 그래 드니 냠슬랭 투피게 고갑 간리지 더 그래 손 메강가 레와침보 세주야 바테 지당가 로마초게 무구 대바 조부송지 점된데 그 투지다 신라 라마 지신 당바 그 투지 나온 그 투지다 신라 라테네 다 틴데 중화래
Through the activity of these great beings, many were caused to have faith in Dharma. And this faith that began to emerge was not ignorant faith, but informed faith, based on the knowledge that Dharma is good for the world, and especially good for those individuals who seek to practice it. People became thirsty for Dharma. They sought a place where they could hear it, circumstances in which they could receive it, how they could practice it, and a place where this kind of practice could take place. So all of these things started to come about through the blessing of the great teachers and through the devotion of the students.
Tene ta teacherna lama jisin tamba ta jawa kama pala sopa namji jang to jawa chimbu goni ta loma tenzola pen to picherdo tene tuji to melam ja chimbu na la tene perna ngaranda boji na tene pe tene ja chimbu chongto ya kaya ngaranga njantana yo marete yinaya ta ngaran namba sanjibe chuchi gola hyunkinji yindu tela ta loma chuela tepachen tenzoge ti rewa kanya chue de nigu samba tenzola de chue de hiepa chue de drupgu samba tenzola ya ti thinking rabo tan dindesi drupgu gere dindesi nyamsa lengu gere sene tene lamnan rabo ten to bache ta ngarang gergi na ngarang lengin rabo ji yin samba rabo Tangarang Chitang Tombi Chuchi Gola Huparella, then Tombi Chuchi Gola Hupachi Indutella, then Sentin Niji Gugre, then Niji Sentin Tomchi Lata, Chitangarang Melam Jabjuramato, Sentin Tomchi, Rewakanto Pache, Yung Tugi Yo Marite, Yinaya, Tatanda Caps Papa La Kari Gugundusena, Tachula, Tepa Yetni, Tachuji Kani Top, Chuji Candis in the Yamson Lane Top, Sompek, Memambu Rewati, Kahila, Tangarang Gang to Pache, dear Sachi Chanaya, Narang Kalva Sampori, Sompeke, Semen, the matter of your.
Now, these great beings, His Holiness the Karmapa and the others, produce tremendously vast aspirations for the benefit of beings and students. I myself have no ability to achieve anything tremendous, but as a follower of the Buddha, I feel it is my responsibility to at least fulfill the aspirations of those who come to me to study the Dharma, so that those who wish to learn, I try to make sure that they have access to what they seek, and those who wish to practice, I try to make sure that they have the necessary instructions and resources for practice. I regard this as my responsibility. If I'm a follower of the Buddha, it must be my aspiration to satisfy all beings. Well, right now, of course, while that is my aspiration, I can't do that. But at least, if I can fulfill the wishes of students, I count myself as fortunate.
Tene ta teacher na tanda tene je ta dukan je ke chargin da ji yoji ya pate pe kalva sangpo jongsong la tene kencho ku tuji tanda pe dendrin da bo yapo ta kasin no hi yapo da bo tende dendri yapo mendroi samba da bo tende jongsong la tende da bo cheji chungwa te ngara kalva sangpo re la tene che namba go ta ngarang samba la che loma sola kasi che pen to tup na samba rewa ye ba yin bicher na che nambe jang ta tela kanga tene che kan tutup tene ta ngarang so pek se na chara tundi 세그래라 차라춘디 세나 되네 단다 수 카히네 차라지 야자나 수 탐지네 야자나 되네 강가 야로 되네 소제네 만투르쇼나 되네 강가 투르쇼
차라스나 강가
차라스나 인데 리엔다 보제
리엔다
잘라지 루나 어디 수 강가네 야고 그러나 된다 보제가 되네 제nom바 강가게 강타타 잠주 나루지 되네 가 투톱다고 다 소수가 가리 투기요나 된데가 거네 강 투톱다고 인지 민지 되네 잠주 나로지 되네 대 잠주 야보지 나나 라라 소수가 주념린 세나야 다 마오발라 penjuga rewarela pengrela chunyalne sesa yapoji unjuga rewarela tene ngaranso changba mainba tene maombe mrablaya detabuga ta ke pengre sompege rewanda bo yorela tin chenambage tusan jachesa ni hini roram kan toda tene jamju naruchi.
I therefore feel that I'm very fortunate, and we're all very fortunate, that we are planning and will build this retreat facility. And I see the auspicious meteorological indications yesterday as signs of the agreement and kindness of the three jewels in this. I therefore ask that you assist this project as much and in any way you can, so that you, as we say, hold up your end, so that all ends of it are held up. Like when you hold up a piece of fabric on which something is resting, if none of the corners are dropped, then the thing will not fall out and fall to the ground. Any assistance you are able to give to this project will not only create the circumstances and environment for your own intensive practice, but will also be a source of continuing benefit for future generations of practitioners. So therefore, hoping that you do so with this vast and long-seeing or far-seeing outlook, I ask that you assist in any way you can.
Tene ta tandaya neka tandi neka laya te te tanglang go ne roram nangke leka chenke hinde punke mangbo chuang la ten tenzo la tuji chi.
And many of you have already helped a great deal with work, with undertaking responsibility, with financial contributions and so forth, and I thank all of you sincerely for doing so. And now we'll chant the dedication and aspiration.